Thank you, Colleen, for that introduction, and thank you, FIT, for hosting this wonderful colloquium today. And also thank you, Alexis and Ellen, and the Fashion Research Network for partnering with FIT to do this. So, some say that a fashion conservation laboratory looks like a morgue. A clinical environment holds body-sized tables that in turn hold body-sized objects, all draped in white sheeting. The palette is a warmed grayscale, everything in shades of white, cream, gray, and silver, designed to be cleaned easily and to show dirt and stains. Or perhaps it's more like an operating room, since this is where fashion goes to be resuscitated by professionals wearing nitrile gloves and lab coats. These doctors work diligently, quietly, with focus over their patients. Their tools evoke a medical or forensic procedure, slender tweezers capable of lifting a single fiber, tiny curved needles used for ocular surgery, miniature sharp razor blades to cut quickly and accurately through cross-sections and samples. Once resurrected, these objects, saved by conservators, join their living counterparts in exhibitions and photographs, their life extended once again. The primary thing alluding to the fact that this lab is for fashion is the riot of color that erupts from the stash of threads and fabrics that conservators use in their treatments. The lab is where objects go to be revived before their next moment of glory. But sometimes, conservators are faced with objects that are barely alive, and they find themselves in an impossible position where they must acknowledge that there is no real life support that they can give. Instead, time has been too cruel to these objects. Perhaps they have suffered damage from a catastrophic episode in the past, or perhaps they have inherent vice, which is an intrinsic characteristic that causes the objects to self-destruct. Like this textile here, these objects are so broken that conservators and curators together come to the joint conclusion that there is no saving them. Instead, they give up, removing them from the museum's collection. Only a shadow of their former self, these objects are disappeared legally and physically from the museum collection through the codified disposal practices of the Deaccession Act. And yet, the conservator might not let them go. Instead, tucking them away on a shelf or a drawer in the lab alongside similarly dead objects with the hope that someday, somehow, they might live again. Few realize that most conservation labs actually have a cemetery full of these dead things. With no official name, nor perhaps even legal standing, the objects in these conservation collections exist in a liminal world between the living and the dead. Shattered and imperfect things, conservators use them as educational tools in surrogate patients, testing out innovative treatments, studying mechanisms of degradation, or simply using them to show fashion's fragility to the public. So my talk today will explore the liminality of these dead, undead objects that exist in the collection at the Conservation Lab at the Costume Institute in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I will show how conservators use these objects to reveal stories about the fragility of fashion and its rematerialization. I will also delve into the politics of the study collection, the role of the conservator as a curator, and give a glimpse at the gloriously imperfect objects held in the Costume Institute Conservation Study Collection. The idea of a study collection itself is a curious thing. Conceptually established as a pedagogical tool, it's filled with objects that are possibly significant, but more importantly, exemplify a type, a moment, or an ideal. And yet critically, these objects are not quite important enough, or useful enough, or just plain good enough to be held in an institution's quote-unquote official collection. The dress you see now is an example of a quintessential beaded and lame dress from the 1920s. Although to a connoisseur, it might be indistinguished in maker, design, or any other aspect. Yet for the conservator, the shredding lame makes it a perfect candidate for the conservation collection, as it exemplifies common damages we find on lame dresses from the 20s and 30s, whose silk yarns cannot compete in strength and tenacity with the metallic threads over time, and so the silk yarns fail. The objects in a study collection accrue meaning not only through their existence, but rather through their examination and handling. Many universities have fashion and textile study collections since the mandate of a study collection, which is an entity established as a teaching and learning tool, aligns perfectly with an educational mission. Schools that allow hands-on access include FIT, Parsons, FITM, Cornell University, and many more. These collections are critical in training emerging scholars, conservators, and curators. In fact, you see here a study collection dress that I myself was faced with as a student in FIT's Fashion and Textile Studies program. At the time, the shredding chiffon straps utterly defied all my attempts at treating them. But thankfully, this gown's status as a study object allowed me to fail and learn in a safe way that would have been catastrophic if done on an object in a museum's permanent collection. Until recently, there has been little investigation into the politics of the study collection. This past year, students at Parsons Paris, under the leadership of Marco Pecorari, recently examined the topic in an exhibition they mounted called Objet d'étude. They describe a study collection as, quote, a collection of fashion objects that are imperfect, often irreparably damaged or stained, and are not integrated into main collections, as they do not meet the selection criteria of perfection, end quote. Now, I know many of us here might contest that definition, but what I really found interesting about the project is that it was a true collaboration with the students utilizing the study collection of the Fashion Museum Moda Museum, also known as MOMU, to, quote, address issues of value, institutional use, and propose alternative ways to discuss the poetics of imperfection, end quote. Much as what I think the Unravel exhibition does here at FIT. Their exhibition culminated in a display of objects from MOMU's study collection, including an exploded Burberry trench coat, which you see here, as well as recorded interviews with professionals such as myself, Carolyn Belios, Linda Lopa, and Shannon Bell Price, whose practices revolve around having access to a study collection. Always the visionary fashion museum, MOMU is unique in that it has purposely built and continues to build their study collection with an eye towards compensating for the restricted access policies to the museum's permanent collection. Their study archive consists of 3 existing collections, as well as pieces that the museum itself has purchased. Significantly, part of their study collection is on long-term loan from the Department of Conservation, Restoration at the University of Antwerp as a gift from a conservator named Chris Don't. So this brings me back to the conservator's collection of objects that are shattered, decayed, and destroyed. What and why do we collect these imperfect, worn out, and broken things? As curators of our own study collections, what kind of object do we look to acquire? The collection in the conservation lab at the CI appears to be assembled in a completely ad hoc manner, with objects unnumbered and untracked. In fact, I don't even know how our study collection got started, but I'm certain that my predecessor, Chris Polachek, had a significant hand in squirreling away objects that were unwanted by anyone except her. I continue this practice today, so I will take any of your old and dead things. Our collection might appear motley, but there's a solid rationale as to why each object has been collected, even if this rationale has so far been unarticulated. And in fact, if I were to create a collecting policy for our study collection, it might look something like this. First, we aim to collect objects that are exemplary by virtue of their sheer ordinariness. This category represents the largest percentage of our collection and contains objects that are utterly undistinguished, yet which display common damages. For example, let's look at these linen handkerchiefs, and yes, Ellen, you can totally take a look at them. Many thousands of them exist in official collections, so as conservators, we prefer to acquire ones that display wonderfully horrid imperfections. That means they must be used, creased, torn, and stained. In fact, the more used and tattered they are, then the more we desire them. It might sound perverse, but handkerchiefs like these make the perfect sample size object to practice cleaning, bleaching, stabilization, and compensation methods before moving on to larger, more complex objects in a permanent collection. Now, objects in our study collection might still be precious. such as this very sweet early 19th century dress. However, the dress perfectly encapsulates a type of object that can be found in many fashion collections. It also displays standard damages that conservators encounter, like yellowing and darkening as the fiber has oxidized and become more acidic. It also has tears and splits in the sleeves, possibly because of earlier hanging, storage, and exposure to light. So while I have no current plans for this dress, I anticipate in the future a conservator in our lab might want to test cleaning methods or hone their skills through practicing stitched or adhesive repairs. This dress is the perfect surrogate patient, since practicing our skills on objects in the permanent collection is unethical according to the code of ethics that all conservators adhere to, which emphasizes do no harm. Recently, I used a shattered and brittle 18th century silk in our study collection to test out different recipes I was making for an adhesive treatment I needed to execute for the brittle and cracking silk skirt on this mid-18th century doll. While the silk in our collection you see on the right was not a perfect match with the doll's dress, it was close enough in age and character that I could refine my adhesive recipe, practice my technique, and gain confidence before I approached the treatment of the doll, which is truly a singular and special object in the museum's collection. Remember, as conservators, we often only have one shot to get a treatment right. And a last example is this 19th century bodice. While charming, it is in very poor condition and would require a significant investment of resources in order to be successfully treated so that it could be exhibited. But it has an important purpose in our collection as it demonstrates one very, very common imperfection we find in fashion garments of all ages, which is the damage that perspiration can cause. You see here the shattered silk fabrics breaking in the exact same area as the perspiration stains. While I have no immediate plans for this bodice, I can see future conservators investigating methods to remove sweat and its damaging byproducts through new enzymatic treatments, or perhaps using an innovative adhesive or infill material to repair the areas of loss. My goal as caretaker of the study collection is to make sure these surrogate patients survive, as they might someday be critical in testing a breakthrough conservation technique at some point in the future. A second, smaller category in our collection contains objects that are broken, damaged, incomplete, or as in this pile of Victorian jet and glass beads seen here on the right, a complete and total mess. While these objects can be used for either study or to test treatments, they more importantly can be used as a source for surrogate material to help repair objects in the permanent collection. That is, they become transplant donors. For example, while the Costume Institute's Yves Saint Laurent dress containing birds of paradise feather is in very good condition, thankfully, theoretically, this specimen in our study collection on the left could be used to compensate for any broken or missing feathers the dress might have. Sources for surrogate material like these are important, especially when faced with the need to replace a missing or damaged element on a garment made from endangered or controlled animal parts, or from a material that is no longer manufactured. Essentially, we retain some objects in our collection as donors of materials that we can someday transplant into our patients. A third, also small category, includes objects that are extraordinary in some way, but as of now are totally untreatable with current conservation techniques and knowledge. Since we can't bear to part with them, we hold on to them. In my opinion, the holy grail of our study collection is this 1967 dress by Diana Dew. She was one of the first designers of wearable electronics, creating light-up dresses that blinked to the beat of the dance floor, and she was featured in the New York Times and magazines like Harper's Bazaar. Unfortunately, no objects by this groundbreaking fashion designer exist in fashion collections today. However, during a survey of our conservation study collection, I realized that we had what amounts to a unicorn. This dress was acquired by the Costume Institute in 1968 and deaccessioned in the 90s because the faux patent leather coating was deteriorated to an untreatable state. Based upon its date and stylistic comparison, I'm almost certain that the dress in our study collection was in the 1968 exhibition Body Covering held at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, which today is the Museum of Art and Design. Her dress in the exhibit was called the movie dress and featured light-up film stills. Today, we use it as a teaching tool, as visitors are allowed to touch and even smell the decaying garment, as well as inspect its electronic components and shedding skin. My hope is that one day we can work with an engineer to see how, or even if, we can get the electronics working again. Another completely unique but untreatable object in our study collection are these shoe trees made of cellulose nitrate, which is one of the earliest synthetic materials that was used in fashion. Unfortunately, the plastic is relatively short-lived and rapidly breaks down, crumbling, cracking, and off-gassing nitric acid, creating malignant conditions for nearby objects. While it may seem strange to have them in our study collection, these shoe trees not only demonstrate how cellulose nitrate can degrade metal, they actually come from the wedding trousseau of Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor. They are quite simply extraordinary objects, and so we hold on to them. In fact, synthetics make up a large portion of our study collection. Some are mundane and common, and thus fit into our first collecting category. For example, we have several of these crumbling cellulose nitrate hair combs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There is no treatment we can do to stop or repair this damage, since the plastic is known to have inherent vice. We hold on to them merely as a teaching tool. An important synthetic polymer that the lab is researching is polyurethane. We hold many polyurethane objects in our study collection, since the synthetic polymer actually exists in several forms and can degrade in many different ways. For example, fashion garments may contain polyurethane foam, since it was used in the 1960s up to today as an interlining that gives shape and volume. Unfortunately, the foam darkens and then powders into dust upon exposure to oxygen. And so the only thing a conservator do is vacuum up the dust that falls away with any movement. Please note the initials IV for the words inherent vice can be perversely written in the dust that was left behind. Another kind of polyurethane that I'm finding to be alarmingly and increasingly a problem is thermoplastic polyurethane, or TPU for short. Used as a textile coating, TPU breaks down, shrinks, cracks, and discolors as chemicals known as plasticizers migrate to the surface. These once shiny and red go-go boots are by Herbert Levine, an important New York-based shoe designer working in the 1960s and 70s. There is no reversing their decay, and so this boot currently resides in our collection as an example of the precariousness of modern fashion. What few people realize, though, is that many of the patent leather coatings used today are still TPU. I included the red Levine boots in an exhibition I curated on synthetic materials and fashion. I juxtaposed it with this white boot from Comme des Garçons from 2012, which is also made of TPU. I wanted to illustrate how at risk our contemporary fashion heritage currently is because of widespread use of polymers like this. Tragically, TPU coatings can also melt and become sticky, pulling away from their fabric substrates. I'm finding that several objects from the 1990s, including pieces by Terry Mugler in the museum's permanent collection, have this condition issue. And so one of our only hopes at finding a solution is to turn to our study objects, like this coat, which is paradoxically called the Triumph, to find a way to successfully stabilize and repair damage. But as of now, the prognosis is not good, as inherent vice continues to stand in the way of a promising cure for sticky and melting TPU coatings. Before I conclude, there is one more kind of object in our study collection. We also collect samples of materials that have a direct connection to objects in our permanent collection. As an illustration, we have worked with our curatorial colleagues to procure material samples from the designer Iris van Herpen for objects the CI has collected. Thus, the museum acquired the moon dress in 2016, and so soon after, the Conservation Lab acquired a sample of the innovative material for the study collection. This otherworldly material you see is actually foamed polyurethane impregnated with iron particles and then shaped with magnets before hardening. However, as you by now know, Van Herpen's use of polyurethane makes long-term survival of this garment tenuous. We were able to work with our scientific department to analyze our sample, and found that it is susceptible to degrade from oxygen, and so we are now in the process of storing the dress in an anoxic bubble. Although these material samples are not objects per se, they are critical to growing knowledge of conservation, and so we welcome them into our collection. In conclusion, the conservation study collection is filled with damaged, imperfect, and incomplete objects. It is not fancy nor glamorous, rather, it's just old stuff in plastic bins. Yet, it is a vibrant and necessary tool for the creation and refinement of conservation knowledge, techniques, and treatments. We primarily collect objects that exemplify a common type of artifact and damage that we might come across. And we use these objects to test treatments and for research and education. We collect objects that might be useful as donors in future treatments where we might need to transplant a certain element. We also hold on to dying objects that are so special we simply can't bear for them to disappear into the unknown. And lastly, we collect material samples that we use for testing and research as proxies to objects in the main collection. The reality is, conservation collections are often so informal and grow so organically that they are almost invisible. There is no online presence, no press, there is nothing that might indicate the rich history some labs hold. These collections reside outside normal archival practices with little institutional structure, support, or access. They are filled with objects destined to die, but rather than die, conservators hold on to them so that they might live another life somehow. And to be honest, there is an unspoken sentimentality that guides our collecting impulse. And so I will end my talk with this image here of a mannequin in our lab wearing objects from our study collection that we proudly and eclectically display. She is the perfect mascot demonstrating the joy and hope with which conservators collect, study, use, and repair imperfect things. Thank you.